Here are the craziest cults you've never heard of. The Fall River Nightmare. The year is 1979, and you're working as a prostitute in Massachusetts. Life hasn't exactly gone the way you planned. Addiction, bad relationships, and bad luck have led you here. Your pimp is a guy named Carl Drew, and lately, he's been acting strange. He started talking about Satan, and not in a joking way either. Drew claims he can physically transform into a demon, that he has real demonic powers, and that Satan speaks directly to him. You think he's lost his mind. But then other prostitutes in the group start believing him. They're attending rituals in the woods, wearing robes, chanting, and then one of the girls disappears. Then another, and another. You start to realize that Carl isn't just crazy, he's dangerous, and you might be next. The Fall River cult was a satanic cult operating in late 1970s, led by Carl Drew, a pimp and drug dealer who used devil worship to control the women working for him. When I say satanic cult, I don't mean some edgy teenagers wearing black lipstick. I mean actual human sacrifices. Carl Drew convinced the prostitutes in his operation that he could grant any of their wishes and that he would change their lives forever. These women were vulnerable, struggling with addiction and abuse, which made them perfect targets for manipulation. If you disobeyed Carl, you weren't just risking a beating. You were risking Satan's wrath, and Carl made sure everyone knew what that looked like. The cult would meet in the woods outside Fall River for their rituals, and these weren't just symbolic ceremonies. They were murdering people. One of the most infamous sacrifices involved a woman named Doreen Levesque. In October 1979, Doreen was lured into the woods by other cult members, where she was beaten with rocks, tortured, and then beheaded during a satanic ritual while the other members watched. A few months later, another sex worker named Barbara Raposa was murdered when she tried to leave the cult. See, leaving wasn't really an option in Carl Drew's operation. If you tried to quit, you knew too much, and knowing too much made you the next sacrifice to Satan. The cult was finally exposed when one of the members, Robin Murphy, confessed to police. She described in horrifying detail how they would perform their rituals, how Carl Drew claimed to physically transform into a demon during the murders, and how the members would participate in the killings to bind themselves together through shared guilt. Carl Drew was eventually arrested in 1980 and convicted of first-degree murder. He's currently serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. But here's where things get weird. To this day, there's serious debate about who actually led the cult. Some investigators believe Robin Murphy, the woman who confessed and testified against Carl, was actually the real leader. They believe she manipulated everyone, including Carl Drew, and then blamed him when the police closed in to save herself. Rumors still swirl that the cult is still operating to this very day. The Ant Hill Bloodbath. If you thought satanic rituals were bad, wait until you hear what torture this cult leader did to his followers for fun. The year is 1977, and you're living in rural Quebec, Canada. You've been struggling lately. You're lonely, barely scraping enough money together to eat, and you're feeling lost. You luckily meet a man named Roche Thériault, who seems to have his life figured out. He's confident, charismatic, and he runs a small religious community focused on healthy living and self-sufficiency. They call themselves the Ant Hill Kids because of their philosophy of working together like ants in a colony. It sounds peaceful, wholesome even. You decide to join them in the countryside for a fresh start. What follows are 12 years of the most cruel and brutal torture imaginable. Roche Thériault was a French-Canadian cult leader who established his commune in rural Quebec with about a dozen followers who believed he was a prophet sent by God. Thériault claimed to have divine visions and convinced his followers that the apocalypse was coming and that only his community would survive. At first, things seemed relatively normal. They lived off the land, grew their own food, and followed Thériault's strict interpretation of the Bible. But gradually, Thériault's behavior became more violent and crazy. He started to believe that he had the divine power to heal people and started performing medical procedures on his followers. There's just one problem. Thériault had absolutely zero medical training. His surgical instruments were whatever he had lying around: pocket knives, pliers, and even a meat cleaver. He would perform these surgeries while completely drunk, and the results were often about as good as you expect. In one incident, Thériault decided a female follower needed an operation, so he forced a tube down her throat into her stomach and pumped her full of olive oil and molasses until she choked to death on her own vomit. Another time, he decided a male follower's testicles were diseased. They weren't, but Therio held the man down and painfully removed them, piece by piece, with a pocket knife. He also began enforcing brutal punishments for even minor misbehavior. And when I say brutal, I mean medieval torture level brutal. Cultists who disobeyed him were forced to sit on burning hot stoves as punishment. A man who violated a minor rule of the community had his genitals nailed to a wooden table. And the craziest punishment of them all was when he forced followers who sinned to break their own legs with sledgehammers to repent to God. The most shocking part is this went on for 12 long years. From 1977 to 1989, Roche Therio ran this torture cult in the Canadian wilderness. Neighbors would often hear screaming in the night, but they unfortunately did nothing. Former members occasionally reported abuse to authorities, but investigations went nowhere because the cult was so isolated. The cult was finally destroyed when in 1989, one of Therio's wives, Gabrielle Laveille, managed to escape. She went to police and showed them her injuries. Therio had surgically removed parts of her intestine with a pocket knife and had amputated part of her arm. Her testimony was so horrifying that police immediately raided the commune. Therio was arrested and convicted of second-degree murder for the woman he killed with the surgery, plus multiple counts of assault. He was sentenced to life in prison. In 2011, his cellmate discovered just how much of a monster Therio was, and he ended up promptly stabbing him to death. Even hardened criminals thought Therio was too evil to live. The Ripper Crew. This cult took the definition of horror to a whole new level with what they did next. Imagine you're a young woman living in Chicago in 1981. You're walking home from work late at night because you pulled a double shift and you need the money. A van pulls up next to you, but before you can react, someone grabs you and pulls you inside. You're driven to a remote location, and that's when you start to see the symbols. Pentagrams, inverted crosses, satanic imagery covering the walls. You realize you've been kidnapped by a satanic cult, and you're about to become a human sacrifice. Known as the Ripper Crew, these monsters operated in Chicago from 1981 to 1982. They abducted, tortured, and ritually murdered at least 18 women, though the real number is probably higher. And they did it all in the name of Satan. The cult was led by Robin Getch, a former employee of serial killer John Wayne Gacy. Yeah, this guy literally worked for one of America's most notorious serial killers, and apparently took down some pretty good notes. Getch convinced 3 other men, Edward Spreitzer and brothers Andrew and Thomas Cocoreales, that Satan demanded human sacrifice, and that killing women would grant them eternal life. Their methods were absolutely brutal. They would cruise around Chicago in a van, looking for women alone at night. Once they found a victim, they'd abduct her and take her to Getch's apartment or another location. There, they would torture the victim for hours while performing satanic rituals. They would mutilate their victims, removing body parts as trophies, and in some cases, they practiced cannibalism, believing that consuming human flesh would increase their satanic powers. One of their practices was particularly disturbing. They would remove their victims' breasts and bring them back to Getch's apartment, where they had created a makeshift satanic chapel. They would place the severed limbs in a box and touch themselves as part of their ritual, believing this act would summon Satan himself. The crew believed they were building power with each murder, and that Satan would eventually grant them immunity from capture. Spoiler alert, Satan did not grant them that immunity. The cult was finally caught in 1982 when one of their victims, Beverly Washington, miraculously survived. She had been abducted, tortured, and had her breasts removed, but she managed to escape and identify her attackers. Her testimony led to the arrest of all 4 cult members. During investigation, Edward Spreitzer confessed to everything. He described the satanic rituals in graphic detail. The murders, the mutilations, the cannibalism, all of it. The other members were less cooperative, but the evidence was overwhelming. Robin is currently serving a lovely 120 years in prison, together with Edward, while Andrew was executed by lethal injection in 1999. The craziest part is that Thomas was sentenced to life in prison, but was actually released on parole in 2019 after serving only 35 years, putting this monster back on the streets, free to hunt again. The LeBaron Polygamist cult. We've talked about cults that tortured and murdered outsiders, but this next cult didn't just kill strangers, it murdered and tortured its own family members. It's 1950, and you have 47 siblings, with your Mormon father having 5 wives. You live in a remote Mexican compound where outsiders aren't welcome. You're taught that your father is a prophet, that he speaks directly to God, and that Jesus himself demands your dad to have multiple wives. Then, one day, your uncle decides that God has commanded him to murder your father, your cousins, and anyone else who disagrees with him. Welcome to the LeBaron family. The Church of the Lamb of God was led by LeBaron, and he is responsible for ordering a horrifying 25 murders. This isn't ancient history either. This cult's violence continues today, with family members being murdered as recently as 2019. The family believes in blood atonement, which is the idea that some sins are so serious that the sinner must literally have their blood spilled to be forgiven. Settled on this messed up belief and took it to a whole new level. In 1972, declared himself the prophet of his own church and proclaimed that God had given him authority to execute anyone who opposed him. His first victim was his very own brother, LeBaron, who led a different Mormon group. But didn't stop there. Over the next 9 years, he ordered the murders of rival prophets, former members who left his church, and even members of his own congregation, whom he suspected of disloyalty. He would issue written death warrants that he called revelations, listing the names of people who needed to be killed. His followers carried out these murders all over Mexico and the United States. In 1977, ordered the murder of Dr. Rulon Allred, the leader of another polygamist sect in Utah. 2 of wives calmly walked into Allred's medical office and brutally executed him in front of his staff and patients. was finally arrested and convicted of ordering Allred's murder in 1979. He was sentenced to life in prison and died of a heart attack in his cell in 1981. But his death didn't end the violence. In 1988, 7 years after died, his followers carried out his final command. They murdered 4 people in an attack that had planned before his death. The most disturbing part is that descendants are still involved in violence related to the polygamous community to this day. In 2019, 9 women and children from the LeBaron family were massacred in Mexico, allegedly by rival polygamous groups wanting revenge. The Narcosatanicos. Alright, we've made it to number 2, and this is one of the most disturbing cults in history. This hellish group manages to combine everything terrifying about cults with everything terrifying about drug cartels. The year is 1989, and you're a college student on spring break in South Padre Island, Texas. You and your friends decide to drive down to Matamoros, Mexico for the day because drinking age is lower and it's only a short drive across the border. You're drinking, bar hopping, and enjoying the beach town atmosphere. As you're walking back to your car, a black van pulls up. Several men suddenly grab you and throw you inside. You're driven to a remote ranch outside the city, and that's when you see the cauldron filled with blood and body parts. You suddenly realize you're about to become a human sacrifice. This nightmare actually happened to Mark Kilroy, a 21-year-old University of Texas student who was kidnapped on March 14, 1989. His murder would expose one of the most bizarre and horrifying cults in history. The Narcosatanicos, which means narco-Satanists, was a cult led by Adolfo Constanzo. He was a Cuban-American drug dealer and practitioner of Palomayombe, an Afro-Caribbean religion that involves animal sacrifice. But our friend Constanzo decided that the traditional practice was too boring. He convinced members of a drug cartel that he could make them invincible and bulletproof to police by human sacrifice. Between 1987 and 1989, Constanzo and his followers murdered at least 13 people, though the real number is probably higher. They would kidnap victims, bring them to the ranch, and torture them for hours before killing them. Constanzo believed that the more the victims suffered, the more powerful the protection would be. The murders were ritualistic and brutal. Victims had their brains, hearts, and other organs removed and placed in a large cauldron called a nganga, along with animal remains, blood, and other materials. Mark Kilroy's disappearance triggered a massive investigation because he was an American college student and his case got international attention. Mexican police raided the ranch in April 1989, and what they found was a scene from a nightmare. They discovered the nganga filled with human remains, multiple bodies buried on the property, and evidence of human sacrifices. When police closed in on Constanza's Mexican City apartment, he ordered one of his followers to shoot him rather than be captured. He died in a hail of bullets along with his male lover and cult member Martin Quintana. His high priestess, Sarah Aldrete, was captured and sentenced to 62 years in prison. The Narcosatanicos case shocked Mexico and the United States because it combined drug cartel violence with occult human sacrifice. This wasn't some isolated cult in the wilderness. This was a group operating in plain sight, kidnapping people off the streets of a major border city and murdering them to give drug dealers magical powers. Colonia Dignidad. We've made it to the final cult on this list, and honestly, I've been dreading having to talk about this one because everything we've covered so far somehow pales in comparison to what I'm about to tell you. This is the story of how a Nazi pedophile built a concentration camp in Chile, partnered with a military dictatorship to torture prisoners, and got away with it for over 40 years. Imagine you're living in 1960s Germany. Post-war Deutschland is still recovering, and everyone's trying to move past the trauma of World War II. You meet a charismatic preacher named Paul Schaefer, who runs a Christian youth group. He seems caring, almost fatherly, and he talks about creating a better world. He proposes establishing a new Christian community in Chile, a paradise where faithful believers can live in harmony away from the corruption of modern society. It sounds like a fresh start in a beautiful country. So, you sell everything you own, pack up your family, and move to South America with him. Unfortunately, you've just made the worst decision of your life. In 1961, Paul Schaefer founded Colonia Dignidad in rural Chile. What nobody knew was that Paul was a former Nazi soldier and convicted molester who fled Germany to avoid prosecution. What he built in Chile wasn't a religious paradise. It was a torture cult. Schaefer acquired 35,000 acres of remote land in southern Chile and established a compound surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and armed patrols. Members were forbidden from leaving. Men and women were separated, and children were taken from their parents to be raised collectively. And by raised collectively, I mean systematically used by Paul Schaefer. Schaefer was a monster, and he created this entire operation specifically to have unlimited access to children. He would use dozens of boys over the decades, and anyone who tried to stop him or speak out was tortured into silence. We're talking electroshock therapy, beatings, and forced medication to keep members compliant. But here's where it gets even darker. In 1973, General Augusto Pinochet staged a military coup in Chile and established a brutal dictatorship. Paul Schaefer saw an opportunity and reached out to the Pinochet regime. He offered the services of Colonia Dignidad, and the Chilean government began using the compound as a secret detention and torture center for political prisoners. People who opposed Pinochet's dictatorship would be kidnapped off the streets, brought to Colonia Dignidad, and tortured for re-education. The colony even had its own hospital, where prisoners were used in medical experiments, forced drugging, and surgeries without anesthesia. This nightmare went on for decades as Schaefer had protection from the Chilean government. So, he was untouchable. The German government knew about the colony and suspected abuse, but diplomatic complications prevented action. It wasn't until the late 1990s, after Pinochet's regime fell, that Chilean authorities finally began investigating. In 1997, Paul Schaefer was charged with sexual abuse and fled the colony. He lived as a refugee for 8 years before being captured and imprisoned in Argentina in 2005. He died in a Chilean prison in 2010 at age 88, having served only 5 years. After his arrest, investigators discovered mass graves on the property, containing bodies of political prisoners who had been tortured to death. The true number may never be known, but estimates put it in the thousands. The colony technically still exists today, under a different name, though it's supposedly under new management. But former members report that some of Schaefer's loyalists still live there, and maintain his dark ideologies.